For this second presentation, we're going to continue with some of the issues that were raised in the first presentation about culture and meaning. But we'll be specifically focusing on what those issues mean for our method of ethnography, and also a little bit of an overview of what it means to use ethnography as a method, and some of the other methods anthropologists use as well. As I mentioned in the previous presentation, there are two potential theoretical problems when trying to interpret what's going on in another culture. And these are ethnocentrism and relativism. So ethnocentrism, as the definition is here, and I have on your note-taking sheet as well, is the tendency to judge the beliefs and behaviors of other cultures from the perspectives of one's own. So an example of this would be that Americans often become offended and have a lot of negative views and learn that particular cultures might eat dogs as food. And so the idea here that it is so ingrained in American culture that dogs are not food, in fact they're pets, sometimes part of the family, etc., that learn that someone might actually see them only as food becomes really difficult for other Americans. So this is an example of ethnocentrism, of looking at a practice from the perspective of one's own culture. And what happens with ethnocentrism is you actually shut down the ability of learning a lot about this particular practice and the meanings behind it. So anthropologists, of course, are very interested in understanding and learning about meanings, so we have to do everything we can to avoid ethnocentrism. Relativism is the conviction that a particular culture's behaviors and beliefs can only be understood from the perspective of its own members. So if we think of the example of an American encountering someone who eats dogs in their culture, we can, instead of viewing it with the kind of judgments I just described, take a more relativistic approach in which you could try to understand it from someone else's, the person within the community's point of view. You might think of it in terms of what's considered food and not in that culture, and understand that dog is understood as food, so the meaning and categorization of the animal is different from what we're used to, and you might understand it as a logical food source in particular situations. And you might also then delve deeper to learn about the symbolic meanings associated with the practice of eating dogs. So instead of judging, you could say that there are good reasons why this is happening with this group, and so therefore it must be right for this group, and that's all that matters. At least that's the extreme relativistic perspective. When we start to think about relativism, we see that there are a couple of issues with it. I'm actually going to go back a slide. I thought I had another slide in here. And one of the issues regarding relativism is that there is a moral problem. Robbins talks about this a bit in the textbook. Classic example is to consider Nazism. In the extreme relativistic view, you might say that this is just their culture and therefore we can't really understand it, and it's not fair to impose our own perspective, so anything goes. Obviously, there's a moral problem with that. With relativism, there's also an intellectual problem. And this problem is that it assumes that there's no way for two cultural groups to understand each other. There's some sort of mutual incomprehensibility. Both sides can't comprehend the others between culture. And that no culture or no one from a given culture could really understand what it's like to be in another culture or walk in their shoes. But we know as anthropologists that it just doesn't work that way, that cultures aren't fixed or bounded, and we can relate to people who have very different experiences from our own. Cultures always change and evolve, so this idea that a group would somehow just completely stay separated from the understandings of another group doesn't make sense. And there are ways that we bridge our beliefs and perspectives between different cultural groups. That doesn't mean it's always easy, and that doesn't mean there's still an open question of if someone can really fully understand what it means to walk in someone else's shoes. But that's almost a philosophical question that comes up in a lot of different types of intellectual pursuits. So for anthropologists, we have to be aware of ethnocentrism, limit it as much as we can, but we can't go to the other side and be so extreme as to say everything goes, as in a extreme relativistic approach. So the ethnographic method is the key method of cultural anthropology. So the goal of anthropology, or cultural anthropology, is to understand different ways of life around the world. This gives us some questions. How do we even understand another culture? And how do we explain another culture to our culture? In the old days, you can think about the way that information was shared. There was no internet, so people traveled somewhere, wrote down notes, came back, and wrote a book about it. And that's how information was shared in anthropology, on this kind of very basic description. Nowadays, it's a little bit different with the access that we have to information all over the globe, from pretty much anywhere if you have internet access. Nonetheless, we still use the same process. So for anthropologists and cultural anthropologists specifically, we say that we can understand another culture by doing a process of ethnography, using a method, a research method, ethnography. Then we can explain that culture to our own culture using ethnographic writing. And this could even be a cultural group within a broader culture. So I do my research here in the United States, and I'm working on a dissertation proposal in which I will be working with weight management groups in the United States and focusing on the recovery movement, especially as it's now being applied to bodies and food and weight management. So I will be then writing about that. My ethnographic writing will be explaining my understandings and interpretations and what I learned about what's happening within that community to a broader American community and perhaps communities around the globe. In any case, ethnography is a word that is used to talk about both our method and the written product we produce. So what is ethnography? As a method, it involves the long-term immersion of researchers into the lives and cultures of the people they're trying to understand in order to learn how they act in their terms and comprehend the meanings they ascribe to their existence. So the idea is that it's long-term. You immerse yourself for a long period of time, at least a year, usually more. Many researchers spend much of their lives working with one community, and they go back and forth between their teaching responsibilities wherever they're teaching and to the communities they're working with for their ethnographic studies. And the whole goal then is to try to understand from an insider perspective to as much as possible, and to understand the meanings they ascribe to their own existence and the things that they do. For this course, you won't be able to do long-term immersion, though your ethnographic project requires that you make multiple observations of the group that you'll be involved in. But a key technique used in ethnography is participant observation. So Robbins gives us a concise definition. He says it's the active participation of a researcher in the lives of those being studied. So that means that you're not only observing, but also participating in whatever is going on. We think that this approach helps you to learn something you wouldn't be able to learn about what it's like to actually do practices if you were only sitting and observing. The participation aspect is really key, and you'll be expected to do that as part of your project as well. Other methods anthropologists use include surveys, interviews, looking at archives, some examples there, and various forms of media. So there's a broader range. For your work, you'll be able to do some interviews, either formal or informal interviews, as part of your project. So ethnographic method really relies on an assumption this is Margaret Mead down here in this picture, by the way, that there's a particular type of knowledge that can be gained that through participant observation, through actually doing things alongside people within a community who do them as part of their experience. And we say that that gives you a type of knowledge that you can't get from any other method. And that's what makes this method unique. Robbins gives an example of how this can work and how someone can, an anthropologist can gain an insider view when he describes Michael Kearney's experience with witchcraft in Mexico. In that moment when Kearney really believed in magic, even if it was a fleeting moment, he experienced the world through the eyes of the people that he had been working with. He could really only get this kind of moment through the ongoing immersion in their culture. You can check that out in Chapter 1. I'm not going to repeat the whole story. But the main point is that's an example of what can be gained from ethnographic research. Let's see. Okay, so there are some ethical concerns that we need to be paying attention to as we engage, of course, in anthropology or in ethnography. So one is that as anthropological researchers, we actually have power. The work we do, the information we collect can actually be put to use by others. So there's a long history of governments using ethnographic information to actually oppress indigenous populations and so on and so forth. So we have to be really careful about that. Within a community as well, sometimes anthropologists have certain types of power because they're outsiders and they're academics and they might be given a high status within a community, depending on the situation. So that has to be something that an anthropologist is careful of as well. So use of research findings is a big issue. I know some researchers who won't publish certain types of findings because they're concerned of how they might be used. As I was just explaining, sometimes information about particular subgroups could actually be used against them by people who are in power. And there are cases of threats against anthropologists related to the politics behind researching with different groups, depending on the type of information they're focusing on. Anthropologists also gain access to information that might not be widely shared to the public. So that's something to be aware of as well. Okay, you've gotten access to this. Now, what should you be doing with it? What is your ethical responsibility to maintain this information in a responsible way? So whenever you're doing any kind of anthropological research, the key thing to keep in mind is that you have to think about the welfare of the research participants above everything else. Some ethical research practices, just to give you a nice overview, you should be employing these in your own small ethnographic project for this class, and also there be ones to keep in mind if you continue in anthropology. So anthropologists must be open about why they're in whatever community they're in and the purpose of research. They can't hide their purpose. There are very rare cases where in anthropology, I shouldn't say very rare, sometimes in anthropology does make the choice not to be open about being in a community doing research. But this is a situation where they really would not be able to gain access if they were open to it, and the result of the information they're gathering is so important that it's justified. The deception is justified. One example is an anthropologist who's done work with white supremacists. And so he entered the community and acted in many ways as part of the group, a new member of the group. And he did not disclose he was an anthropologist because for semi-obvious reasons, if he had, he probably wouldn't have been able to stay within the community, and he felt like this was a community that was producing quite a bit of harm, and so it was justified to understand more about what was going on within that community in order to bring that information to the public for use. So there could be cases like that, but for the most part, and you guys won't be doing that for your work, so for the most part, you need to be very open about the purpose of research. Second is participants must have the opportunity to give consent. So you have to explain what you're doing and ask people if they consent to being involved. Third, anthropologists have to explain what information will be used, and that really allows participants to give informed consent. If you just tell them, oh yeah, I'm doing a project and I'm wondering if they'll participate, well, that, they might say yes, but they're not really informed about what kind of information you're collecting and how it will be used. So for your project for our class, you need to explain to your participants that you're doing a project for school. People are usually pretty understanding about that. It's for an anthropology class. It involves looking at observing communities and writing about a topic related to them, and writing that you will be writing a paper for our class as part of that. So all that information is important to share. Okay, finally, anthropologists always must take steps to protect privacy by changing identifying details such as names, locale, etc. So people always ask to what degree do they have to change names, and the whole idea here is that you're protecting your research subjects. So anything that might be identifiable information where someone reading it could trace back the person you're talking about to a specific person, then you need to change that detail. So we'll be talking more about that when I assign the assignment, but that's going to be something important for you as well. The bottom line is do no harm, right? Do everything you can to do no harm. So beyond the ethical concerns, we have to consider about ethnography as a genre of writing. So it's the result of ethnographic research, and we go ahead and write that up, and that's how we share information, mostly in the scholarly world, but not only. Okay, so when we are working on producing an ethnography, we have to think about how we can translate our findings into a text that people from our own culture can understand. This can actually be quite challenging. When you're in a community and you've gained an insider perspective to the extent that you can, it can be hard to then come back to a broader community or a different community and explain what it was like, and explain that insider view. So ethnography is something that we have to be careful with. For some of the ethical reasons I just described, for example, what you publish in ethnography can be used. You have to consider how it's going to be used by scholars and also other people who might get their hands on it. The other thing that you really have to be careful of is avoiding exoticism. So that National Geographic show Taboo is an example. Sometimes they show some things from there, but for the most part, the way that things are presented in that show are very exotic. And exoticism pushes people away from an actual understanding and pushes them towards a far more ethnocentric perspective. So you should watch for that as you're watching different programs that might just be on TV, or even films that we watch for this class. So ethnographers do their best to avoid that, but it's not everything we watch is ethnography, and not every ethnographer does a great job avoiding ethnocentrism, even if they try. And the last thing we really have to understand is that ethnography always leaves something out. So anytime you have a written account about a community, it's never going to be complete or thorough or the final word on the community. And that is the nature of doing ethnographic work. So it's just something to also keep in mind. So we're going to wrap up by talking about culture again. So all of this has to do with what we try to do as anthropologists and our methods, and so we're coming back again to our central term, culture. Another way, in addition to talking about culture as a text, to think about culture is to understand that it's a way of making sense out of a universe that lacks a sense of order. So these meanings and practices give us something to hold on to that helps us make sense of what's happening within the world. So a cosmology is a belief system. It's an overall view of how the world works. Given this definition up here, that it's this part of culture that includes the set of practices and meanings. And these have a couple of different aspects. They organize places and things in the world morally, so what's right and wrong. They organize things in the world socially, places and things. So here is the realm of social organization, social relationships, how we're connected to other people, and technically, how people make use of things, practical aspects of one's worldview. So all of this is to introduce you to a term that you will come across in anthropological work, which is cosmology. People talk about American cosmology and Korean cosmology and so on and so forth. So what they're referring to there is this aspect of culture that has to do with meanings and organizing things and places in the world. This term originated with Emile Durkheim. So he's a key figure in social sciences, one of the fathers of social sciences, shall we say. He was born in the 19th century, and I think he died in the early 20th century. He's a French sociologist, and so he's known primarily as a sociologist, but we as anthropologists draw from sociology, especially the early sociologists as well. And he's one of the founders of the social sciences, as I said before. He wrote a book called The Elementary Forms of Religious Life, among other books, that was particularly influential in anthropology. Emile Durkheim argued that in religious... Well, let me back up for a minute. Emile Durkheim is really important because he made this argument that morality comes from society. So instead of it being based on some inherent sense of being human, he said it actually comes from society. It's through the influence of society that we start thinking about others, and society holds itself together through a shared world system. So he was really interested in how societies can maintain cohesion for a number of different reasons. He grew up and experienced a lot of social upheaval and change during his life, war, and so on, and the Industrial Revolution. And so he was trying to understand some of these changes in society, and this key question of how society holds itself together was really pressing on him. So he said, holds itself together through a shared world system, cosmology, and that was really important. The way that people access that shared system, or one way, is collective effervescence, which is the transcendent experience of the social. So by this, he's making the argument that religious rituals specifically are the place where people experience collective effervescence. Through these events, these collective experiences, people rise above themselves and start thinking about the interests of the society as a whole, because they're so unified. So one of the examples, he was mostly focused on religion, so he was considering this in multiple cultures around the world and looking at how collective effervescence was a piece of their religious experiences all around. But we can see this in a secular way when we have American baseball games where everybody stands and sings the national anthem. Durkheim might say this is an example of collective effervescence because it's a time when most people in the stadium are coming together in a collective action, and they experience the social as separate from themselves, or themselves as part of the social is probably a better way of saying it. So there's a kind of unity there that's really important. Another way of experiencing this kind of transcendence is going to a concert, of some kind of musical concert, and everybody's dancing together and getting so into the music, and outside of the way they would normally act, and also within the groups to such a degree that they're no longer focusing on their own individuality. So that's a kind of basic primer to Durkheim. To keep in mind some of his key points, I've summarized them here. So you can kind of consider these over the next few weeks, and also just understand, because he was such an important figure, what some of his basic ideas were. So Durkheim made this connection between culture and customs in creating a cosmology. And he talked about how society holds influence over the people who comprise the society. So you don't just have individuals with beliefs, you have a social circumstance which is actually influencing individuals. He also brought this idea of a force connected with collective experience that really has power to create a shared sense of identity. He may not have used the term identity, but we can think of it in that way, this experience of unity and something shared, something in common. That was really important, a really important insight that anthropologists have continued to work with. And he brought in this idea that symbols and categories are all meaningful and impact our lives and how we connect ourselves to other people. Symbols are powerful because they recall that cosmology that they refer to. In other words, when we see a symbol, and in fact, I didn't even think of this when I chose the picture, but the baseball example, there's a huge American flag in there, right? And so that symbol connects to a certain system of organizing and thinking about the world that brings to mind on some level when we see that symbol. And it's also involved in tying us together to a larger group. Okay, so that was the main things I wanted to recap and emphasize about Durkheim. As we continue through the rest of the quarter, you'll see some of these ideas emphasized and approached in various ways as well.